Seam finishes are one of those things that you probably don't think a lot about when you're starting to sew. And to be honest, I didn't think a lot about them when I was learning to resew. So back in 2020, you look at my garments from that time period, you would be shocked at the complete lack of seam finishes. And that's partly due to the fact that when I was learning to sew, I was making projects for class and it wasn't actually things I was wearing. So I didn't really worry about having to finish the seams because they weren't actually going to get worn and they weren't going to be washed or anything like that. Fast forward to a few years ago, and not finishing your seams makes them look really sloppy after your garment's been washed a few times. Today I'm sharing 3 ways to finish your seams that are super easy, even a beginner can do it. And best of all, you don't need any fancy equipment or a serger. So keep watching. Hi, I'm Tony, and this is So Lounge. Now, one of the easiest ways to finish your seams is using pinking shears. And if you don't know what pinking shears are, they are those funny scissors that have the little zigzag edge on them. And you use that to cut your fabric and make little triangle edges along your seams. Now, this is one of those methods that I used primarily when I was learning to sew, when I remembered to do it. And I actually got these Gingher pinking shears from my grandma for Christmas back when I was in college. Now, if you've used pinking shears, you probably know that it's not a perfect solution to seam finishes because depending on your fabric, it could still ravel even though you've taken the time to finish the edges. So today I'm going to show you a slightly modified and updated version to finish your seams with pinking shears that I think will have a much better and long-lasting result. I've made some little sample seams. These are all 5/8 inch seams. That is the standard commercial pattern seam allowance, and that's what we're going to be working with today because that's probably what you're going to be using when you sew. My machine is set to a 2.5 length stitch. It is just a basic straight stitch, and I am using black thread, so it's going to be a little bit easier for you to see. I'm lining up the outside edge of my fabric with my presser foot, and I have moved my needle over just one to the right, so it's a little bit closer to that outside edge. I'm going to sew the stitch line, and then we are going to pink up to the edge of that line. Now that we have that initial stitch line in place, go back in with the pinking shears and line them up along that line and then pink. The next seam finish is similar to the first in that we're going to sew a stitch line and then sew a zigzag stitch next to it. Now, the whole point of sewing the straight stitch line along the edge is to provide some additional stability, which will then support the pinked edge from the first seam finish and now a zigzag stitch from the second one. So I'm going to move my needle over to the left, roll it down, and then start my straight stitch. So the first time I sewed this, my camera was slowly pointing in the wrong direction. So next we are going to stitch the zigzag stitch right next to the straight stitch. And to do that, we are lining up that straight stitch on the inside left edge of the presser foot. Now that my zigzag stitch is all stitched in, I can go back in and trim the excess part of the seam allowance next to that zigzag stitch, but just be careful you don't get too close because you don't want to mess it up. The third seam finish I'm going to show you today is the turned under seam finish. This is one of my personal favorites. I think it looks the neatest. It kind of encloses that seam allowance so you don't have to worry about it fraying, but it's not actually like a whole bound seam or anything like that. To do this, you just turn the edge of the seam allowance towards the seam and then fold it under and then give it a quick press. Now that both sides of the seam are pressed under, I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and stitch it in place. So the easiest way to make sure that you catch this bottom edge, which isn't exactly lined up because it was kind of hard to fold and not get burned, is to line up the inside edge of the presser foot with the outside edge of the folded over seam finish, and then to just stitch next to that. So I'm going to roll my needle down and then get started. And this is going to make sure that it gets caught. So as long as you just have the edge of the folded edge just under the presser foot, that'll hold it in place. Make sure it doesn't get caught in those feed dogs. And then also ensure that it gets caught where it's supposed to so that it holds everything in place and doesn't come apart. I did not do a great job showing that line straight, but it's caught. So you can see that even though the little edge is under here, that's going to be protected because once we go and give everything a press before we move on to the next piece of the garment, it'll be in there neatly and folded, and that'll hold it in place, and hopefully you sew a little straighter than I did. Now you know 3 different methods to finish your seam allowances. There's the super easy pinking method, and if you don't have pinking shears, you can always get a pinking blade for your rotary cutter. Then there's the zigzag stitch method, which requires a little bit more thread and a little bit more patience. And finally, my favorite, the turned under method, which requires some pressing but results in very neatly finished seam allowances. Regardless of which method you use, I think we can all agree that when you take the time to finish your seam allowances, the inside of your garment will look just as beautiful as the outside. I've got another great video coming up next. This one is going to help you manage your time the next time you sit down to sew. I know you're going to love it. I'll see you over there.